Hi, I'm Brent Johnson, and this is Real Visionaries. So here we are in Puerto Rico for Real Vision, continuing on with the Visionary series. And I can't really think of anybody more visionary than someone who's trying to figure out how to live forever. And with that, I want to welcome Sebastian Brunemeier.
Thanks, Brent. I've been a fan of Real Vision for many years, and particularly your interviews. So it's an honor to finally be on the show.
Good. Well, we're excited to have you. And I was mentioning to a friend of mine that I've met so many interesting people in my time here in Puerto Rico, and I definitely consider you one of them. And I think what we'll do today is maybe we'll just rehash the same conversation we had when we first met. I'll be very honest, it's a topic I know next to nothing about, but is extremely interesting. So maybe as a little bit of an intro, you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you're doing right now, and then we'll kind of get into how you got to where you are and ways to think about it.
Sure. So I'm a biotech VC and longevity biotech company founder. So I've founded a handful of companies over the last few years and worked with some of the leading venture funds in this space. I won't bury the lead. So, there is this field of longevity biotech or long bio where we have been able to extend the healthy lifespan of mice by about 30% in the lab, many labs all over the world. And there's every reason to believe that we'll be able to translate these results over to humans in the near future. And so there's a huge industry sort of building around longevity biotech. And when I got in the field about 10 years ago, it was pretty fringe. There were people like Peter Thiel and Aubrey de Grey and Bob Nelson from Arch investing very early. But now, in the last few years, I've been really pleased to see that there are billions of dollars flooding into the space from very prominent names, and even big pharmas, which are typically very conservative, are backing the space. So I think the train has left the station and the snowball effect is going. But it's a really exciting space to be in. It's hard for me to imagine a more relevant, interesting field than slowing the pace of aging and thereby treating all of the major age-related diseases. So, my own background, how I got into this space, I went to college and I thought I wanted to be a medical doctor, but I realized that being a medical doctor in America is not so great, in part because the drugs don't work very well. And there didn't seem to be a very rapid pace of progress. So sort of building on Peter Thiel and Tyler Cowen's technological stagnation hypothesis, despite all of the breathless proclamations that were a cure for cancer is just around the corner, since the war on cancer in the 70s, there's been very little progress. I mean, it's only been about 5% increased lifespan for cancer patients if you look at all cancers. So, I was sort of exposed to the work of Aubrey de Grey and his book Ending Aging. And, I was hooked because I could see that we're at an exponentially increasing risk for age-related diseases as a function of age. And the only way to really extend healthy lifespan and deal with the demographic problems of population aging, the silver tsunami we call it, would be to actually slow the pace of aging. And it turns out we can do this in the lab, in many different lab animals, by targeting the fundamental hallmarks of aging. And I can elaborate on that if you're curious. So anyway, I decided not to be a doctor. I got into bench research in the lab and worked at a bunch of different research institutes. I got a Fulbright to work on telomere biology, which is one of the key mechanisms acting as a check on cancer, but it's also critical for longevity and stem cell function. And then I ended up working for a family office in London, investing in biotech of a Russian businessman. And then I ended up doing 2 master's degrees at the University of Amsterdam, one in molecular neuroscience related to brain aging and the other on biotech business management. Purportedly teaches you how to build a biotech company, although, the only way to learn that is to actually do it. And then I helped launch what is today one of the largest aging-focused venture funds in the world, Apollo Health Ventures. And I also concurrently was doing a PhD at Oxford in biochemistry, specifically biochemistry of aging. And so, while I was doing that, I helped build a biotech company in Oxford called Samsara Therapeutics, which is working on autophagy. So this is this cellular repair process. There was a Nobel Prize awarded in 2016 for autophagy. Basically, when you do fasting or exercise, or you take certain drugs that extend healthy lifespan, autophagy is in play. Autophagy is Greek for self-eating. So the cell breaks down its internal components, its organelles, and then rebuilds them. And genetically enhancing autophagy is sufficient to extend healthy lifespan in mice about 15%. And they don't get fat if you overfeed them, and they're resistant to a lot of different age-related models of disease, including neurodegenerative disease. So when I launched Samsara, autophagy was not really very well known in the biopharma space, but in the last several years, there have been a bunch of big acquisitions by big pharma of autophagy companies. I later was asked to co-found a company called Cambrian Biopharma, which is today one of the more prominent companies in the longevity biotech or long bio space. And we have up to almost 20 assets targeting different aspects of the biology of aging. We've raised significant capital and have pretty compelling investor base and board of directors. So this has been great to see that there's a lot of industry validation of the longevity biotech space. Because again, when I got into it 10 years ago, it was fringe. But now all of the mainstream voices are, I would say it's arguably the hottest area of biotech today. And one piece of evidence supporting that is just a couple weeks ago, there was the largest seed financing in history, $3 billion out of the gate for a company called Altos Labs. And Altos is made up of luminaries in the longevity field, professors who've left their tenure track positions to do this, and some very well-known biotech management, including Rick Klausner, who was the head of the National Cancer Institute. And recently, the CSO of GlaxoSmithKline, Hal Barron, left Glaxo somewhat abruptly to help lead this new company, Altos. So these kind of people getting into longevity biotech space indicates that we're really at a turning point. There was another interesting advance in the funding space about, I think, 5 years ago now, which is Calico. So Google put, I think they're up to $3 billion in a partnership with the big pharma company AbbVie to create this sort of Bell Labs of aging. So Bell Labs, the legendary AT&T R&D center that came out with a couple Nobel Prize winning innovations, inspired this model where you just get the best minds in longevity biotech together, and drugs will come out the other side. I've been investing broadly across the space. I have my own company now, which is called ImmuneAge Pharma. So we're developing drugs that rejuvenate the immune system, targeting the bone marrow stem cells, the hematopoietic stem cells, and the thymus. And I also have my own venture fund. It's just getting started called HealthSpan Capital. And we're investing early to build these companies because academia, the academic spin-out system is not super efficient, and there are not very many biotech founders, and you need that initial seed capital in a substantial amount to launch a company in this space. So we're trying to bridge that valley of death. And I work with a handful of other VCs and investors to build these companies in the longevity biotech space.
Well, along the way, you obviously had an interest in science, or you wouldn't have done 2 master's degree and a PhD program, or your numerous different educational endeavors. If you weren't interested in it just from a philosophical or an educational or just personal interest, but at some point along that path, you decided not to just be a scientist and decided to get over into the business side. I'm just curious, were you always interested in the business side, but you just had an affinity for science, or did you always like the science and then at one point you said, well, I don't want to be a scientist and I want to be a business person?
Yeah, I get that a lot. People see me as a business person, but in my heart, I'm still a scientist. That's what really excites me. But the beauty of being a VC is I get to be at the cutting edge of science. I get to meet with the leaders in the field, and I get to know the science before it's even published. But I don't have to do the physical work in the lab. So it's the best of both worlds for me. As for the philosophical underpinnings of longevity biotech, it goes back quite a long time. I mean, we can go back to Hammurabi, the Sumerian king. He was questing for the elixir of life, and many people have done so since. But it's only been the last couple decades that we really understand the fundamental molecular and cellular biology of the aging process. And we can intervene in it to extend the healthy lifespan of mice up to 30% presently and rejuvenate already old mice. So it's pretty amazing. Some of the companies I've worked with have developed drugs that you can administer to an old mouse that's sort of got graying hair and it's hunched over and it's not really running around a lot. You can give it these drugs and it'll reverse those. It'll, look youthful again. Yeah, so anyway, the philosophical underpinnings of longevity biotech, we've known for about 100 years, since the work of Clive McKay at Cornell, that fasting, caloric restriction, extends healthy lifespan.
Is that why the whole keto thing, the people do the intermittent fasting?
Keto,
it goes back to that same research?
Keto is related, and a lot of this hinges on insulin signaling and growth factor signaling. So a ketogenic diet is where you significantly cut carbs and you get a lot of calories from fat. And there are a lot of medical applications to the keto diet, such as epilepsy treatment. For about 100 years, it's been used to treat epilepsy. But it also, surprisingly, extends lifespan in mice, similar to caloric restriction. And one of the reasons it's beneficial for a lot of people is you tap into your own fat stores. You can burn your fat and produce these molecules called ketone bodies that are an alternative fuel source for the brain. And so there's some promising work in Alzheimer's, for example. So one of the theories about Alzheimer's is it's type 3 diabetes. So it's central nervous system resistance to insulin. And so if you lower glucose, you can resensitize to insulin, and you can provide alternative energy source in the form of ketones. And there are other reasons why ketones are beneficial. They affect, like beta-hydroxybutyrate affects gene expression in a salutary way. But we've known that caloric restriction works really well, and it's just really difficult to implement, right? Because it goes against our evolutionary design. Nature wants us to get fat. I think there's a book to that with that title. But one of the really hot areas of geroscience, this field of longevity research, is caloric restriction mimetics and autophagy enhancers that I mentioned earlier. So what if you could have your cake and eat it too? What if you could derive the benefits of caloric restriction and fasting without having to forego the cake? You could take a pill. And we've got some molecules that do this in animals. So anyway, going back to the history of the geroscience field, until around the early 90s, most of the scientists in the field thought that aging was just too complex to have a simple intervention like a gene mutation or a drug that would significantly extend healthy lifespan. There's a lot of evidence that human longevity has already been somewhat optimized relative to closely related species. But it was building on the breakthrough work of people like Cynthia Kenyon at UCSF, who's now leading R&D at Calico, that you could mutate one gene in a simple model organism in the lab and increase its lifespan significantly. I think it's 50%, and healthy lifespan at that. This gene happened to be the insulin receptor. Again, a lot comes back in aging to nutrients and metabolism. And so that was kind of a watershed moment in the field, and a lot of people said, wow, let's find all of the aging genes, and let's start finding drugs, particularly small molecules, that would extend healthy lifespan. And so today, we have over 100 genes that extend healthy lifespan across species, and somewhere around 50 different drugs that extend healthy lifespan. And so my job and the job of people in the field is to translate those findings in the lab into the clinic and into age-related diseases to start out with, but ultimately for aging itself. So we envision a day in which a doctor can prescribe a drug for aging as a prophylactic, almost like we have statins or metformin to intervene preventatively. So, one of the reasons I was really attracted to longevity biotech is because it has the potential to eat the lunch of the traditional pharma model by targeting the root causes of disease rather than palliating the symptoms. The traditional pharma model is also sort of distorted by a lot of early success. So antibiotics are, I think, instructive for the longevity revolution. So at the turn of the 20th century, antibiotics were, unimaginable to a lot in the field. I mean, most people at the time were dying of infectious disease. So if you were to tell a doctor of that era, we're going to develop a whole class of drugs that will prevent pretty much everybody you know from dying from what they've been dying from. We're going to bring infectious disease under medical control. And despite recent issues in antimicrobial resistance, which is a huge problem, infectious disease is pretty rare as a cause of death in the West.
Well, I think this is kind of what made our conversation pretty interesting, is because we were talking, we met and we were talking, you were telling me what you're doing. And of course, the whole idea of, extending life, living forever, it's a very intoxicating idea, right? But one of the things you said is, oh yeah, we can do it, or we're going to be able to do it. And it wasn't like, kind of this philosophical idea. You were fairly matter of fact about it.
Yeah.
And so one of my questions is, when along the road, I mean, people have been studying this for 100 years, or hundreds of years, thousands of years. How do we live for searching for the fountain of youth, right? When did it become a thing where, oh, we know we're going to be able to do this, as opposed to just the search? Like, is this in the last decade? Is this in the last 2 years, last 20 years?
Yeah, it's been mounting really over the last 20 years, I would say. The field of geroscience is heavily underfunded. It's less than 1% of the NIH budget, which is about $45 billion a year. There's a lot of money going into specific age-related diseases like Alzheimer's, but not very much going into the root cause of these age-related diseases. But over the last 20 years, that's been slowly changing. It's become a field that a professor can go into. And so the pace of progress has been rapidly increasing. But it's been, I think, increasing at an ever faster pace, sort of exponentially, as these things do. And one of the advances that's caught a lot of people's attention recently is epigenetic reprogramming. It's been known for a very long time that cellular immortality is possible, and it's been happening for, as long as sexual reproduction has been happening, because the germline, the reproductive cells, are immortal. They're passed down generation to generation. It's called the immortal germline. It's in large part mediated by epigenetics. So what are epigenetics? You have certain chemical marks attached to the DNA or the histones that the DNA is wrapped around, and that regulates gene expression. So the DNA in a skin cell and the DNA in a brain cell are pretty much the same. The only difference is what genes are turned on and off. And this developmental process is regulated by epigenetics. It turns out that aging is also epigenetically regulated. And so the marks on these genes can actually be wiped away or rewritten. And there was a Nobel Prize awarded in 2012 to Shinya Yamanaka and John Gurdon. And what Yamanaka showed was that you could take a skin cell from an adult aged human, put it in a dish, treat it with certain genes, transcription factors called Yamanaka factors, and it will reset the epigenetic age of the cell to a day zero embryonic-like stem cell. And given that the human body is just a collection, it's just a collection of cells, we can rejuvenate a cell, we can rejuvenate the whole body. There are some technical challenges to implementing this in the clinic, largely the problems that face all of gene therapy, which is a delivery problem. You just can't deliver the genes of interest to enough cells in the body to make a difference and control the expression levels of those. But there are advances being made in vector technology to deliver genes to cells. And furthermore, several groups are working on this, including a company I financed in the UK, Shift Bioscience. We may be able to find small molecules or a cocktail of small molecules that recapitulate the effects of these Yamanaka factors. One of the challenges with Yamanaka reprogramming has been when you treat the aged cell, it's de-differentiated back to an embryonic-like stem cell. We couldn't do that in the human body because you'd lose your brain cells. You'd become basically an embryo. But it turns out, and Calico has showed some of this at Google recently, you can distinguish the aging marks from the dedifferentiation marks. So you can retain cellular identity while also reversing aging. Some caveats to epigenetic reprogramming: it doesn't fix everything with aging. So it doesn't fix DNA damage. Mutations that happen to the DNA are still there. So we need to pursue that, even if Yamanaka reprogramming works as well as we all expect. And the telomeres are not re-elongated, at least in most cases. So anyway, this has been sort of a watershed moment in the field. And it's gotten usually very sort of conservative minds, big pharma types into the space, and Altos with the $3 billion financing round, and some very prominent investors backing it as well.
So what's the relationship like between the capital that's trying to get into the space and the scientists who are doing the work? Is it a good relationship? Do the scientists see the capitalists as a necessary evil, or are they excited about it, or are they kind of annoyed about it? That's a world that I'm not familiar with at all, but I imagine it's a little bit more fraught than what you might automatically think it is.
Yeah, it may be a little early, but the relationship between investors, VCs, and professors and company founders is quite harmonious, actually. It could be something to do with the vibe of the long bio field. We've been pretty collaborative and open. That's changed a little bit as huge amounts of capital in the billions have been.
I guess that's my point. Like when money gets on the line, sometimes it's not as friendly.
Yeah, there's a bit of jealousy, check size jealousy going on, but it's pretty minimal. I've helped launch a handful of companies. In total, the companies I've been affiliated with or helped launch have raised about $400 million in the last 4 years. The professors are really keen to collaborate. Universities, despite their bureaucracy, are really keen. I think people are just seeing the huge potential here, and they're excited to work on it. So it hasn't been a very political process so far.
One of the things you were telling me was like many of the things the diseases that would eventually kill you, or the factors that would eventually cause someone to die, are caused by aging. So if you stop the aging process, then you stop the dying, or at least defer the dying, right? Yeah. But this is maybe the cynic in me, but to me, there's a huge industry that makes a lot of money from people who need help from the ages 60 to 80 as they're starting to die. Is there pushback from that industry that's like, does somebody who tries to treat cancer, do they really want cancer to be treated if it's going to put them out of business? And I know, again, that's cynical, but I'm just curious, is that ever discussed? Does that kind of stuff ever come up when you're looking for funders or people that are wanting to invest in the space?
Sure. So long bio is eminently disruptive industry. It can, like I said, eat the lunch of the pharmaceutical sector entirely. Exactly. Fortunately, pharma has been embracing us and pivoting, like, for example, the CSO of GSK joining Altos. It's a common conspiracy theory that pharma is hiding the cure for cancer somewhere. I think we're right to be skeptical of pharma and cynical about pharma, especially on the business side and the marketing side. But the scientists are actually quite ethical, the ones I've dealt with. So I don't think that makes sense. And pharma, it's kind of like a cartel issue. So, right, if there were a cure for cancer that pharma were hiding, it would be really hard to keep that cartel intact, right? Kind of like with OPEC. They all want to overproduce or whatever. So I'm not as worried about that. But there have been some interesting trends in biopharma. Biopharma has been basically cutting R&D for some decades now because their investors say, well, don't waste money on the future.
This is kind of where I was going, was like, when money gets involved, some decisions seem to get changed. So this is kind of where I was kind of get to. Yes.
Pharma, they have been outsourcing a lot of their R&D. So there's data from the work of Andrew Lo, professor at MIT, finding that it was about 15 to 17 of the best, of the 20 top selling drugs in the year 2000 were originated in pharma internal R&D pipelines. Today, about 17 of the top 20 best-selling drugs originated in small biotechs or academic drug discovery, spin-outs from universities. So it indicates that there's sort of a maturation of the field of academic drug discovery, and pharma is passing the baton, because pharma is really good at late-stage clinical trials, marketing, things like this, but since they've been gobbling each other up, it's become cartelized, and they're not very good at internal R&D. It's too bureaucratic, and the incentive structure is perverse. So you kind of have to ask yourself, generally, startups versus big corporates. How is it possible that startups with relatively little capital, small teams, which could be an advantage, not much credibility versus pharma, which has all of the resources available to it, how are these startups continually disrupting these big incumbent organizations? How is that possible? And I think it's something to do with the incentive structure. As a startup founder, you've got skin in the game in the form of equity. Your reputation rides on the success of your company. So people are really focused, and it's not very bureaucratic. So Google has this, I think it's called the 2-pizza rule. And on any project, you can only have the number of people that 2 pizzas would feed. So there's something like that going on in startup world as well. But in any case, Andrew Lo has also shown a really hopeful trend. So there's been a big problem, kind of an existential problem in the pharmaceutical sector over the last, say, 20 years, which is pharma R&D has been exponentially declining in efficiency. So you have to put exponentially more money in to get a new drug approved. And it's sometimes called Eroom's law, a term coined by my friend Jack Scannell, which is the inverse of Moore's law, so the semiconductor processing power. So people are scratching their heads trying to figure out what happened. And there are a lot of theories about it. I mean, one is, the low-hanging fruit has been picked. That's sort of a flattering one for pharma. The other one is to do with cartelization and getting, bloated and sort of lazy in a sense. In any case, this trend, fortunately, has been reversing in the last couple of years. So you can actually look up Andrew Lo's data. Clinical trial success rates and approval rates have been rising in the last 2 or 3 years significantly, almost doubling, especially in some therapeutic areas. So some of these areas are gene therapy. So for rare genetic diseases where we know exactly the mutation that's driving that disease, it's easier for us to treat it and even cure it. This is one of the challenges with age-related diseases relative to these simple genetic Mendelian diseases, which is caused by one single mutation that we can see in a genome sequence. With aging, it's complex, multifactorial. And so once we've sort of picked the low-hanging fruit in terms of infectious diseases, genetic diseases, symptom palliation, it's really difficult to develop drugs for age-related diseases. The underlying pathophysiology has not been known. And pharma really didn't have much interest in the root molecular causes of aging. So there was this advance in 2013, this sort of critical paper called The Hallmarks of Aging, written by some of the leaders in the field, one of whom I launched a company with. And they break down into 9 hallmarks or categories of the molecular damage that causes aging.
I mean, so clearly when you think about all the money people will spend to either look better or feel better or, extend the life as they know it now, there's a huge opportunity here, right? If the opportunities that you've been describing come to fruition, there's obviously going to be not only a lot of interest, but a lot of money to be made. And, when we were speaking, you mentioned to me how much money exactly has there been coming into this space and some of the better known people who are putting money in. So maybe just give the audience an idea of what you mean when we say that.
Sure, yeah. There have been some very prominent investors coming into the space. I actually wrote down some of them because I don't want to forget anybody. So early to the space was Peter Thiel. He actually financed some research that I did at the Buck Institute back in the day. Joe Lonsdale, Stan Druckenmiller, who's been on the show, Steve Jurvetson, who's backed all of Elon Musk's companies, financed one of the companies I helped launch. Jeff Bezos, of course, Yuri Milner, Brian Armstrong from Coinbase, Vitalik Buterin, who's been on the show, a lot of crypto people too. There seems to be sort of a nexus between crypto and longevity. There's a lot of overlap there. In fact, one of the co-founders, if you will, of Bitcoin, Hal Finney, was an outspoken longevity activist. And a lot of big funds have been invested. Andreessen Horowitz, Arch Ventures, and Bob Nelson has been investing in the space for many years. Mike Novogratz, who's been on the show. The Google founders, also on the board of Cambrian, is Marty Chavez, who is the former CFO of Goldman Sachs, on the board of Cambrian. And then a bunch of big pharmas, so particularly Novartis, AbbVie, and Regeneron. And then we have about half a dozen aging-focused venture funds. So one of the best, although I'm biased, is Apollo Health Ventures. I joined as the third scientist several years ago. They've got about 200 million under management, which is a lot for the company building space. And it's led by Jens Eckstein, who was the head of GlaxoSmithKline's venture fund, SR1, for some years. And initially financed by my friend Niels Rega, who is one of the more successful German entrepreneurs. So, you've noticed a lot of these investors are billionaires, and, they've realized that you can buy a lot in this world, but you still cannot buy extended healthy lifespan. And the message I want to give to your viewers, who are mostly, finance money grubber types, that I've become a bit of one, is it doesn't matter how rich you get. If you're in poor health, you can't benefit from it. And the field of biomedical science has been sort of barking up the wrong tree in that it's been cutting off the heads of the hydra, which are age-related diseases, cancer, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, et cetera. But the heads just kind of regrow. You have to deal with the root cause, which is the fundamental damage that causes aging. And in the lab, hundreds of labs all over the world, we can slow this process in lab animals. And these drugs are now getting into the clinic. So, I think the field is ripe for significant infusion of capital. Unfortunately, like I said, governments are slow. Less than 1% of NIH funding goes to longevity, geroscience, longevity biotech. So hopefully that will change. And, we've got a lot of lobbying efforts talking to various governments to try to increase funding in this space. And the demographic reasons are pretty compelling.
Yeah, I want to get to the demographics in a second, but before we go there, let's just talk. Obviously, if you're a billionaire, you have a lot of ways to invest that the average person does not have access to. What would you say to the average person that, hears this talk, wants to allocate some money into it? Is investing in kind of private deals really the only way to get here, or is there some public options as well?
Yes, so it's quite a new field. The number of longevity biotech companies has been rising exponentially, but they're almost all privately held. There are a couple listed longevity companies, but really not many that are targeting the fundamental core biology of aging. So as an investor, you have to invest privately, so you can do directs into these companies, reach out to me if you want to, and you can invest in the venture funds in the companies. So Apollo is one. I work with one called Vine Ventures. I have my own nascent venture fund, HealthSpan Capital. So any billionaires out there that want to invest with us, get in touch. So yeah, at present, it's hard for retail investors or public market investors to get exposure to the space. But that's going to change. I mean, a couple of the companies that I help launch have plans in the next couple of years to IPO. And so I'd say there are about 5 companies in the longevity biotech space that have raised, a couple $100 million in capital each that are marching toward the public markets.
Well, one of the other things you just touched on it a minute ago, and when we had our initial conversations, one of the things that kind of really I was kind of interested in, and it made me think a lot since we had that conversation, was the effect on demographics. I'm a very big picture thinker. I think on the macro space, and there's few things more important on the macro space than demographics. And the success or the future success of this area would have profound impacts on demographics. and I can think of some good attributes and positive outcomes from this on demographics, but I can also envision some problems from demographics. And so maybe share some of your thoughts on that.
Sure. As you know, demographics are destiny, it's often said. So, pension systems are not designed with longevity in mind. I think pension systems started with Otto von Bismarck trying to curry the favor and allegiance of his subjects, but people didn't live very long back then, so like 2% of people would ever draw down from their pension. So we're a little bit victims of our own success because longevity, lifespan has been increasing rapidly, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down. So the pension systems will need to adjust. They can, move money around and figure out how to deal with that. But there's actually a really good thing about extended healthy lifespan. One is the intrinsic benefit, which is we all want to live longer, healthy lifespan. I'm not going to wake up one day and say, like, I'm over it. As long as I'm in good health, I want to keep living for as long as possible. And if we can, and not if, I think when it happens that bringing aging under medical control is the standard of care in medicine, and we're living to our genetically defined maximum, it will reduce the burden on healthcare systems. Because right now, toward the end of life, in the last, say, 5 or 10 years of life, we're not in good health. And this is when we're most expensive to the healthcare system in the last few years of life. And so, there's a population of people called supercentenarians. Some of them live in certain regions of the world where it's very healthy, it's called so-called blue zones. And some are genetic supercentenarians. And they actually live a really long time in good health and then one day just kind of pass away in their sleep peacefully. So I think this is the goal, everyone's goal. And what the NIH has stated is or the NIA, National Institute on Aging, has stated as their mission is the compression of morbidity, which is to reduce the period of time spent in poor health at the end of life. So if we can do that, we can reduce the medical costs that are threatening to bankrupt the United States. Diabetes, it's not, the greatest threat to homeland security is diabetes and obesity, okay? It's not, terrorism or wars. It's our own health.
Yeah. High fructose corn syrup is probably a bigger threat to...
Exactly. High fructose corn syrup is a greater threat than Al-Qaeda.
Right.
For sure, by a wide margin. So anyway, if we can address demographic aging by slowing the pace of aging and extending healthy lifespan, there's an additional benefit. It's called the longevity dividend. There's a demographer, J.L. Shansky, who's written about this, which is, suppose Einstein had another 10 years of healthy life and productivity, or Tesla, or, great thinkers, John von Neumann. It would be fantastic for society. And so if we could just increase the period of healthy life, and you could sort of move the dependency ratios a bit, the ratio working to non-working proportion of the population, that could be a huge benefit to the economy. And if we don't do that, if we do not extend healthy lifespan, I think healthcare costs are already 15+% of US GDP. And we have what's called the silver tsunami. So the demographic aging pyramid, the baby boomers are starting to get sick. So if we treat the root causes of these diseases, which is aging, as we can see in the animals, they live longer, healthier lives, and that will at the very least buy us some time to advance the economy and to get organized in anticipation of the silver tsunami.
Yeah. Well, what for the audience that's following along, if they find this interesting, they want to learn more about it. What is there websites they can go to? Is there magazines they can subscribe to? Is there books they should read? Like how do people find out more about this?
Yeah, so there are a lot of resources out there. So a good primer into the field is a book called Lifespan by David Sinclair, who's a professor at Harvard, who's active in the biotech space. And also one called Age Later by Nir Barzilai, who's also a professor at Einstein College. You can subscribe to a really good newsletter called Longevity Market Cap newsletter run by my friend and partner Nathan Chang. There's also a useful website called longevitylist.com that lists most of the longevity biotech companies and the investors in the space. If somebody wants to invest in the field, they can get in touch with me, and I can connect you with the various venture funds, including my own, HealthSpan Capital. And that we have an angel list rolling fund, so you can actually write small checks into that in addition to a larger pool of capital.
So one of the other interesting parts of our conversation was when you talked about some specific interventions, and I'm not going to even try to pronounce the words that you said, but they were pretty interesting, and I'd love to have you kind of go over that again here.
Sure. So a couple that really captivate the attention and are easy to understand. One is this kind of crazy vampire reminiscent intervention called heterochronic parabiosis. So you surgically link the circulatory systems of an old and a young mouse. You sew them together. And the old mouse gets a bit younger and the young mouse gets a lot older. And so, some of this research had been done over a century ago, but it was sort of revitalized by some groups at Stanford, Irina Conboy at Berkeley now, and Tom Rando. And they, got a lot of press attention because people were joking about, all right, where can I get my hands on some young plasma, et cetera. It turns out young plasma probably won't do much good. It's actually that there's bad stuff in the old blood. But that's actually convenient because we can develop antibodies that will neutralize these deleterious pro-aging factors in the blood. And there was actually an interesting study conducted by this company, Alkahest, in collaboration with Grifols, which is one of the largest blood products companies, and that's a public company, in which they did sort of plasma replacement therapy. So it's almost like bloodletting of George Washington's day. You remove a large amount of blood and replace it basically with saline plus albumin. And it dilutes the bad stuff in the old blood. And they showed in a phase 2 study in Alzheimer's disease pretty compelling data indicating this prevents cognitive decline. And there's reason to believe that reducing these pro-aging, pro-inflammatory, anti-stem cell factors circulating in the old blood is a really good therapeutic approach. So that is heterochronic parabiosis. It's captivated a lot of attention. There's somewhat, in addition to epigenetic reprogramming, there's some sort of lower hanging fruit therapies as well, which are some of these small molecules. So there are FDA-approved drugs that extend healthy lifespan in mice, and a bunch of supplements that do the same. So one of them is metformin. This one, I think, is a little overrated in the aging field, but it extends mouse healthy lifespan about 5%, and it enables humans with diabetes to live about as long as non-diabetic controls, which is incredible. And it works by sort of acting like a caloric restriction or fasting mimetic. It reduces glucose production in the liver. So metformin is one. A lot of people in the aging space take metformin. It's kind of like almost like if you're a Freemason or something, that's like your calling card if you're taking metformin to show that you're really hardcore. But if you want to be even more hardcore, you take rapamycin. And rapamycin is a drug that was actually, same with metformin, almost lost to history. So it's kind of amazing that pharma is as successful as it's been because they keep losing or shutting down productive areas of research. And one of them was rapamycin. So it derives its name from Rapa Nui, Easter Island, the island with the big heads, because it was derived from a soil microbe found there. And a chemist at Wyeth was working on it, and he found that it was really a special compound, but it was his research division was shut down. He stashed it in his freezer for some years and later revived it. And it turned out that this drug, rapamycin, became one of the most important therapies for transplanting of organs because it's an immune suppressant. So you get a kidney donation. You have to suppress your immune system in order to accept it. It's also approved for a couple rare cancers. But the reason it's really interesting in the geroscience and long bio space is it extends healthy lifespan of mice between 10 and 20%, and it works in most animal models of age-related disease. things like Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease. It's salutary across the board. And it works by inhibiting a protein called mTOR, and this protein governs, it's a master conductor of metabolism, and in a sense it mimics fasting, and it induces autophagy, and it does a bunch of other stuff. The trouble is, you don't really want to take at least high doses of rapamycin chronically because it'll suppress immune function. So there have been a couple of groups in the field that are developing new analogs of rapamycin that are devoid of these side effects, but still retain the lifespan extending salutary properties. One company, Apollo, built, it's called Aovian Pharma in the Bay Area, developing analogs. We've raised about $40 million to go into the clinic with these new low side effect analogs of rapamycin. And Cambrian, a company I co-founded, has just licensed in assets from Novartis that are mTOR inhibitors. So this is kind of like the first flagship molecular target and small molecule in the longevity space, and it's super well validated. And hopefully it was just the first of many to come, because the field of geroscience has been chronically underfunded. It was fringe for many years. And so as more governments and private investors and philanthropists fund this area, now that the proof of concept is solidly in, I'm confident we're going to surpass and blow out of the water some of these effect sizes of these existing drugs. But that's an FDA-approved drug that you can take yourself, but take it in consultation with a doctor if you're going to.
Well, a few years down the road when we can all live forever, we'll look back on this and we'll talk about it as the interview with a vampire.
Exactly, yeah. 200 years old tomorrow.
Exactly. Well, no, this is fascinating discussion. I think it's endlessly interesting. And I appreciate you taking the time today to sit here with us and go over it all.
Yeah, thanks for having me.